My cousin sneered, "You don't deserve a cent," when he stole my share of the trust fund. So I secretly bought his debts, then foreclosed on his house. It's funny, in a bitter kind of way, how family can bring out the best and worst in us. I'm Delwyn Moss, but everyone in my family calls me Del. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, a city where family names and traditions run as deep as the tides. My family isn't exactly what you'd call tight-knit in the usual sense, but we've always had our ties. Some of them are pure love, some are obligation, and then there are the tangled, messy ones we don't talk about. Growing up, I was always the steady one in the family, a little too quiet for my own good, and a lot too forgiving. My cousin Warren, now, he was the golden child. I still remember being a kid, sitting around at Thanksgiving, watching him dazzle everyone with his charm. Warren would tell some wild story about his latest big move and have the whole room in stitches. He'd flash his watch or talk about his new car, and everyone ate it up. He knew how to work a room, and it came in handy. Problem was, I think he eventually forgot how to work outside one. Warren and I were never close, exactly, but we orbited around each other for most of our lives. He had a knack for showing up only when he needed something. Like the time he got into a bad spot with his business, he came to me, hat in hand, asking for a loan. "Just until the end of the month, Del. You know me, I always make good," he'd said, eyes glinting with that familiar, self-assured smile. I gave him the money, of course, but I never saw it again. "Oh, something came up, Del," he'd say later, waving it off like it was pocket change. My mother, God rest her soul, would just sigh whenever I told her about it. She knew Warren well enough, and she'd been on the receiving end of his antics more than once, but her philosophy was always, family looks out for each other, even when it hurts a little. And so I kept Warren at arm's length, doing my best to be the good cousin, the one who never complained, the one who could take it. When Mom passed away last year, I thought I'd come out of it with some closure, maybe even some peace. I'd always been her quiet rock, the steady one by her side, especially during her last few years. I thought I'd done everything right. So when I found out about the trust fund, a part of me thought it was her way of looking out for me, even after she was gone. She'd always been careful, preparing for everything, and she'd set aside a good amount, enough to help me find some security. It wasn't flashy, but it was a blessing, especially with my job not being as stable as it once was. It wasn't until I got a call from the family lawyer a few weeks later that I realized something was off. "Delwyn, we're going over the trust documents, and it appears there's been a shift in the assignments. Your cousin Warren has filed a reassignment of your share." I felt the air leave my lungs. "A reassignment?" I echoed, feeling my throat go dry. "Yes," the lawyer continued, his voice careful. "Warren convinced the trustees to temporarily transfer your share to him. He claimed he needed it to manage the estate in your absence. But I didn't. I wasn't absent," I stammered, feeling the frustration boil up. "I was with my mother until the very end. I don't understand how this even happened." "Delwyn," he said, a note of sympathy in his voice, "the trustees didn't know the full picture. Warren has a way of making things sound reasonable." That was the understatement of the century. I went over to Warren's place the very next day. He lived in a sprawling, white-columned mansion just on the edge of town, a monstrosity he liked to call his palace. When I got there, he was lounging on his front porch, sunglasses on, sipping something with an umbrella in it. He barely looked up as I walked over. "Well, if it isn't my dear cousin Del." He greeted me, grinning like we were old pals. "Warren, we need to talk about the trust," I said, barely keeping the edge out of my voice. "Oh, that." He waved a hand, as if I'd brought up something as trivial as the weather. "Listen, Del, I know you're probably a bit surprised, but you've got to understand, this is all about family." He leaned back, taking another sip. "I'm just making sure things are managed properly." I felt my hands clenching at my sides. "Managed? Warren, that's my share. Mom left that for me." He tilted his head, studying me as though he was slightly amused. "Del, be honest with yourself. You're not exactly. Well, you don't need that kind of money, not like I do." His eyes hardened. "Besides, what would you do with it? I mean, really?" I felt a familiar heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "That's not for you to decide, Warren. You had no right to take what's mine." He shrugged, the picture of casual arrogance. "Look, if it means that much to you, maybe we can come to an arrangement. But you've got to stop acting so entitled." Entitled? The word felt bitter on my tongue. Here was a man who'd mooched off everyone in the family, who'd taken loan after loan without ever repaying a dime, telling me that I was acting entitled. I swallowed hard. "Warren, I want my share returned. I won't ask again." He looked at me with a smirk that made my stomach turn. "Or what, Del? You'll tell Aunt Caroline? Look, I get it, you're upset. But try to see the bigger picture here. I've got a lot on my plate, and I'm the only one in this family who knows how to handle it." I walked away that day with a rage simmering under my skin. For weeks, I tried to convince myself it was just money, that maybe I could make peace with it somehow. But the more I thought about Warren, sitting in that oversized house, living off of what was meant to be my security, the more determined I became. This wasn't about money, it was about my mother's legacy, about my own dignity. That was when I reached out to a friend who worked in investment. Through a few discreet conversations, I learned just how deep Warren was in debt. Apparently, his lifestyle was held up by a teetering mountain of loans and unpaid credit. He'd leveraged every asset he had to keep up the image, borrowing against his home, his car, even his business. And with a little help, I realized there was a way to turn this mess around. I went to the bank, meeting with an agent who listened to my story with a sympathetic ear. I'll never forget his face when he looked over Warren's files and saw the debt piling up. "Well, it wouldn't be easy," he said slowly, "but if you're serious, I could arrange for you to quietly buy his debts. That way, when they come due, he'll have to answer to you." It was a risky move, and I knew it. But I didn't hesitate. Over the next few months, I managed to acquire the bulk of Warren's debts, doing everything through third-party companies so he'd never see my name attached. I barely slept during those weeks, waiting for everything to fall into place. When the last of the transactions went through, I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Warren wouldn't know what hit him. The day I informed him was one I'll never forget. I showed up at his house with a stack of papers, watching as he fumbled, confusion turning to horror as he realized what was happening. What is this, Dell?" he stammered, his face going pale. "It's a notice of foreclosure, Warren," I said, meeting his gaze with a steady calm I hadn't known I had. "I bought your debts. And if you can't pay them off, you're going to lose everything." His mouth opened and closed like a fish, his bravado evaporating. "Dell, you can't. You wouldn't do this. Your family." "Funny, I thought you believed in looking out for family, even when it hurts," I replied coldly. "But this is different. You know I'll come up with the money, I need time." His voice was pleading now, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel even an ounce of sympathy. "You had your time, Warren. All I ever wanted was what was mine. You made your choice." The look on his face was one I'd never seen before, a mix of shock, anger, and something like desperation. He'd always been the one in control, always the one calling the shots. But now, he was backed into a corner, and he knew it. "Dell," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please. I can't lose this house. It's all I have left." I took a breath, feeling the weight of years of silence, years of being pushed aside, building inside me. "Maybe now you'll understand what it's like to lose something that mattered." I handed him the final papers, walking away without looking back. But even as I left, something in me felt unsettled. This was only the beginning, and I knew that Warren wouldn't let things end here. I wish I could tell you that was the end, that I handed Warren his comeuppance and walked away feeling triumphant. But with family, especially family like Warren, nothing is ever that simple. Not a week after that showdown on his front porch, Warren showed up at my door. I opened it to find him standing there, looking haggard and out of place. His usual smug grin was gone, replaced by a look of desperation I hadn't seen before. He was holding a thick folder, his knuckles white where they clutched the edges. "Dell," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Can we talk?" I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a pang of something close to pity. Seeing him stripped of his bravado was surreal. This was the man who'd spent his life bulldozing anyone who got in his way. But pity or no pity, I wasn't about to let him off the hook. "What could we possibly have to talk about, Warren?" I asked, not moving to invite him in. "Please, just hear me out." He swallowed, eyes darting around like a cornered animal. "I have a proposal." Against my better judgment, I let him in, more out of curiosity than anything else. He took a seat on my couch, shifting uncomfortably. I could tell this wasn't his usual game, whatever it was. He looked broken, or at least, as close to broken as someone like Warren could get. He opened the folder and slid it across the coffee table toward me. "This is everything I have left. My business shares, the last of my savings, my car. Everything." He looked at me, a flicker of something close to sincerity in his eyes. "Take it. Take all of it. Just give me back the house." I glanced at the papers in front of me, seeing the desperation in every line and signature. I knew this was his last card, his final attempt to wriggle out of the mess he'd made. Part of me wanted to take it, to finally end the whole ordeal. But another part of me, the part that had been humiliated, stolen from, and taken advantage of for years, wasn't satisfied yet. This wasn't about getting back what I was owed, it was about making Warren understand, once and for all, that actions had consequences. "I don't want your scraps, Warren," I said, pushing the folder back toward him. "I just want you to own up to what you've done. Admit that you stole from me, that you lied to the whole family to get ahead." He blinked, clearly taken aback. "You think I don't know that?" "I know, Dell. Believe me, I know." He slumped, rubbing a hand over his face. "But I've got nothing left. The house. It's the only thing I have to my name." I stood up, feeling a cold calm settle over me. "Then maybe you'll learn to live without it, The way I had to learn to live without what you stole from me. Actions have consequences, Warren. You can't just keep using people and walking away when it's convenient. His face twisted in anger, the old Warren finally resurfacing. You're just like the rest of them, Dell. You think you're better than me, don't you? No, I replied, holding his gaze. But I know I'm better than the person you wanted me to be. After that, Warren didn't come around anymore. I thought he'd finally given up. But a few days later, I started getting calls from family members, all of them indignant, demanding to know what I'd done to Warren. Apparently, he'd been going around to anyone who would listen, spinning a story about how I'd stolen his house, how I'd manipulated him into debt, painting himself as the victim. It was like watching him pull the same con all over again, except this time, his audience was family. Aunt Caroline called me one night, her voice shaking. Delwyn, I just don't understand. Warren's your cousin. How could you be so cold? I felt the frustration boiling up. Aunt Caroline, do you know why I did this? Do you know the kind of debt he was in? He's been lying to all of us for years, using family money, including what my mother left for me. And now that I'm holding him accountable, he wants sympathy? She paused, and I could tell she didn't have an answer. I don't want to see the family torn apart over this, Dell. Can't you forgive him? Aunt Caroline, I tried that. All my life, I tried that. But sometimes, forgiveness just means letting someone keep hurting you. And I'm done being that person. Over the next few weeks, I kept my distance, letting the family drama run its course. Warren was doing his best to turn them all against me, and part of me wondered if he'd succeed. But then, something shifted. One by one, relatives started calling, asking questions about what had really happened. It seemed that Warren's story wasn't holding up under scrutiny, and the more people dug, the more they uncovered about his shady financial dealings and unpaid debts. At our next family gathering, it was clear the tide had turned. Warren showed up late, looking exhausted and humiliated, his usual bravado replaced by a tense silence. No one fawned over him this time. Instead, there were whispers, sidelong glances, family members murmuring about taking advantage and being selfish. Warren stayed for less than an hour before slipping out, his face flushed with embarrassment. I thought that might finally be the end of it, that Warren would quietly retreat and lick his wounds. But instead, he kept pushing back, refusing to let go of his right to the house. It got to the point where I had no choice but to formally foreclose. The day the papers were finalized, I half expected him to show up again, to beg or scream or pull some last trick. But he didn't. Instead, I got a single text from him, 3 simple words that summed up his bitterness. You'll regret this. I stared at the text, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I knew I wouldn't regret it. Not anymore. But I also knew that this was the final nail in the coffin of whatever family bond we might have had. And in that moment, I was finally okay with it. As the weeks passed, I heard snippets of Warren's life post-foreclosure. He'd moved into a cramped apartment on the other side of town, far from the big house he'd once flaunted. His business had gone under, and the friends he used to brag to had all but vanished. Family gatherings were quieter now, with a strange sense of relief hanging over everyone. Even Aunt Caroline, who had once defended him, told me quietly one night, "You did the right thing, Dell." Warren had it coming. I never expected to find peace in any of this, but as the dust settled, I realized I'd gained something I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in my life, I felt free. Free from Warren's manipulation, from the family's expectations, from the weight of always being the quiet, forgiving one. I'd stood up for myself in a way I never had before, and it felt good. It felt right. As for Warren, I heard he'd taken a job somewhere, something far below the lifestyle he used to flaunt. Every now and then, I'd get a call from someone who'd seen him around town, looking a little worse for wear. And while a part of me could have pitied him, I knew he'd earned every bit of the life he was now living. In the end, I didn't need his apology or his regret. I had my own closure, my own peace. I'd learned that sometimes, the best revenge isn't just getting even, it's finally moving on, without looking back.